Off White Sands Bay, a lost world lies buried beneath the waves. Undisturbed in its watery grave since it was frozen in time more than 10,000 years in the past. And amidst this other world of antler, bone and petrified trees are to be found the remains of people too. Long before even the first farmers came to Britain. Out here on the far western extremity of Wales, it isn't difficult to picture such lands of long ago. When red deer, auroch and monstrous brown bears stalked through the woodland. A time of different tongues, different cultures, different people. For the place has an older name too. Porthmore, meaning the big port. A reminder of its usage in ancient times as an embarkation point across the sea road to Ireland. From the Bronze Age all the way through to the medieval era. And in early medieval times, archaeology suggests this to have been a place of great significance too. Just off the shoreline, above the sunken forest, still stands the recently excavated St. Patrick's Chapel. Really a tiny structure, but one of the earliest of its kind found anywhere in Britain. Radiocarbon dated from the 6th to the 11th centuries. A mixture of adults and children of all ages were buried here. Testament to a harsh time in the wake of Roman rule, when just a handful of people made up scattered communities across the islands. Sometimes still clinging to a life that came before. Looking to better days. Their remains found in cist graves. Their lives recorded in scattered pieces of archaeological evidence. Many of the names from this region have their roots across the sea in Ireland. A highway in those days, and much more accessible from here than many other regions of Wales. But of course, other, older influence can be seen on these people too. Newly Christianized and left adrift on the Irish Sea by their Mediterranean converters. Tales like the sunken realm of Cantra Gwaelod, the Lowland Hundred, popularly thought to have once existed beyond the marshes between Aberystwyth and Aberdyfi. Often eerily similar to real submerged worlds off the shore at places like Borth and elsewhere, with their petrified forests like White Sands Bay. A of entrances to the mystical otherworld, sought out by mere mortals on epic quests. Through mystical rocks, underground, and above all else, off islands in the Western Ocean, across water. An insular Celtic universe still kept alive today in epic sagas written down in the later Middle Ages. That otherworld was a land of never-ending youth, where time passed differently and eerie supernatural events were the norm. Of fairy hunts and sacred objects, crystal castles, little folk and giants. Unlike most other places in the world, a great deal of evidence survives from these stories. But perhaps, most famously, it is recorded in the 19th century corpus known as the Mabinogion, still often considered the national epic of Wales. A little further along the coast, on the other edge of St. Bride's Bay, herself an Irish saint. More evidence of the Western orientation of people here in those middle days of the first millennium AD can be seen in a much more substantial settlement. Protected now by its isolation on a rocky outcrop of jagged cliffs. This is Gatehome. First excavated in 1910 and again in 1930. The place was initially speculated to be an early Christian monastic site, like those purported at the time at Tintagel, Skellig Michael, and elsewhere. Albeit one overlooked by a great fortress of the Iron Age Celtic past on the shore opposite. A century of intermittent digging in the years since has instead revealed a fascinating and unique settlement of many hundreds of people, continuously occupied for a vast period of time, all the way from the Bronze Age to the early Middle Ages. Still completely coated in faintly visible roundhouses, and more complicated rectangular buildings too, testament to Mediterranean connections as well as those of ancient British forebears. With densely populated, well-ordered streets on one of the busiest seaways in Britain. In the post-Roman age, Gatehome was far from an isolated nor peripheral place. Originally an easily defended promontory settlement, today the neck connecting it to the mainland has fallen away, turning this into an otherworld of its own. Recent speculation on stone phallus symbols found here, again suggesting a sacred meaning to the place, albeit a magical, pre-Christian one. A place apart. Not monastic cells, but a Celtic holy site, protruding into the waters. But after the Roman era is when things get really interesting. because here was found continental Mediterranean pottery, amber from the distant Baltic, and, tellingly, a bronze cloak pin of an Irish design, dating to somewhere between the 5th and 8th centuries AD. It was in places like this that the rich historiography of Britain developed, and with tiny hints of writing and monastic communities on this coast too. Just maybe, on occasion, it was written down here, honed down the centuries, perhaps hand in hand with a thriving oral tradition, ultimately solidifying into some of the tales which still survive today. By the time the Welsh bishop and biographer of Alfred the Great, Asser, put quill to vellum in the 9th century AD, 200 or 300 years after the heyday of Gateholm and St Patrick's Chapel, that great pillar of learning uses just one word to describe the surviving Romano-British lands of Wales, Brittany, and Cornwall: Britannia. And Asser has a point. Though the once singular tongues of those regions were by then already distinct, having embarked on separate paths over the previous 4 centuries, their culture remained surprisingly uniform. Indeed, it is from these lands that we get the surviving stories and myths today, some of the oldest found anywhere in the world. Tales which shaped the very society to develop in centuries to come, from which J.R.R. Tolkien and Geoffrey of Monmouth alike not just derived inspiration, but arguably could not have existed without them. The former using Old Welsh as a basis for the Elvish languages of Middle-earth, the latter bringing Arthur into the world. A little over a century before Asser, in the early 8th century AD, the Venerable Bede has a little more to say on the matter too. Recording 4 distinct peoples inhabiting the island of Britain: the English, the Picts, the Scots, and the Britons, with a 5th language, Latin, sometimes uniting them all. By his time, Christianity providing the overarching framework for myth-making. Leaving a lot of room for origin stories linking current nations to distant cousins, and offshoots to the biblical family of Noah, dating back to Adam and Eve, the ancestors of all humanity. By linking to post-flood ancestors, divine legitimacy and the right to land could be claimed. Within the rich corpus of early medieval stories, therefore, we are told the origin myths of each of these peoples of Britain. Many of the tales are nonsensical. Of the English, the Saxon Inga was said to have been responsible for the name, Albina for Albion, Of the Scottish, an Egyptian princess gave her name. But others contain tiny shreds of reality, and of much earlier stories too. All alike can give fascinating insights into these lost worlds. The oldest of all, arguably, is a tale with ancient Indo-European roots, as well as biblical myth. Seen in the writings of the 7th century AD writer Isidore of Seville, as much as Arthurian chronicler Geoffrey of Monmouth in the 12th century. It speaks of Brutus, the grandson of Aeneas of Troy, and legendary founder of British civilization. In order to tell the tale of how Britannia became Wales, of how the ancient British and their descendants viewed their own history until very recently, we must go back to the very beginnings of the mythological tradition. To the largely forgotten tale of the mighty Trojan warrior Brutus, and the giants who inhabited the land before. Though undoubtedly having biblical inspiration, the tale begins at Troy. That most important, foundational of places for the classical world. When the works of Homer were just as important as any Abrahamic holy book. For despite their defeat by the Greeks in that ancient conflict, early medieval historians, just like their classical predecessors, regarded the Trojans with the utmost respect. Though adapted and changed a great deal over hundreds of years since its first form in the centuries immediately following the collapse of Roman Britain, the basic spine of the tale remains remarkably similar. Following the turmoil of the Trojan War, the conventional date used by medieval scholars being precisely 1183 BC, the mighty hero Aeneas and his followers make their way across the storm-tossed seas to Rome to lay the foundations of that venerable city. Meanwhile, some years later, another Trojan lord, a grandson named Brutus, embarks on a similar journey of his own. Battling enemies and adventuring as he goes. In Greece, Brutus and his band come upon 7,000 of their kinsmen, men, women, and children, reduced to slavery. Upon realizing their shared ancestry, Brutus has no choice but to act, instigating a mass uprising, escape from bondage, and voyage westward to new lands. As those fellow members of the Trojan diaspora continued to make themselves useful in the coming battles, their leader, Corineus, described by Geoffrey of Monmouth as a just man and good advisor of great character and boldness, rises through the ranks to become the right-hand man of Brutus himself. His people, distinct from the beginning, would ultimately be known by his name, Cornish, and their land, Cornwall. And crucially for the events to come, Corineus is a giant killer. Finally, after yet more conflict in Aquitaine, Brutus and his host are reminded of a prophecy and decide to set sail to an obscure land lying off the sea to the north. Coming ashore at Totnes, just south of Dartmoor, where an ancient stone is still said to mark the place of the landing. But there is a problem. Britain is already populated by a race of violent and hideous creatures. The literal spawn of devils in many variations of the tale. Colossal in form, vicious and brutal in their ways. Thus began a war to eradicate that ancient race of giants. To win Britain by right of conquest. The tale culminates with the mighty giant king, Gog Magog, facing off against Corineus in a wrestling match. Chained and kept alive for Brutus's sport, Gog Magog is a force to be reckoned with, able to pull an oak tree out of the ground as if it were a twig of hazel. And yet, Corineus, a mighty warrior of superhuman strength, has slain giants the world over, able to overcome them as if he were fighting a child. In the ensuing battle, Gog Magog is hurled off a cliff into the sea, his mighty form kicking and screaming as he disappears under the waves. In this way, in time, all the giants are killed. Just a few surviving in the ancient places, in hidden glens and mountain peaks. Passing into popular folklore, like Jack the Giant Killer, who climbed up the beanstalk, which still survives today. The giants thus eradicated, the island of Britain, named triumphantly for Brutus, is free for settlement and the light of British civilization to be brought forth to the wilderness. The legitimate inheritors of the country. Though the capital city is initially named Trinovantum, New Troy, by the time of Brutus's descendant Lud, it will be renamed Caer Lud, London. The transformation from Trojans to Britons complete. It's a great story, and though severely lacking in historical reality, after all, according to Geoffrey of Monmouth's garbled narrative, Stonehenge had been built as a monument to 460 Britons massacred at peace talks by Saxons at Amesbury. It does give a fascinating insight into the reality of the medieval mind. For when Geoffrey recorded his version in the 12th century, tapping into a well-established literary tradition but adding his own creative spin, it would become one of the most famous stories in Europe. As always, Geoffrey had an agenda. He wrote during the Anarchy, a period of societal turmoil in the 12th century, when anything seemed possible. His overall aim, perhaps, being to broker alliances between the Britons and the new Norman elite. As a Cambro-Norman, he walked in both worlds, seeking to forge a common past together, including the Britons in the well-established and well-known continental Mediterranean traditions, such as the Trojan War and the war between the Titans and the Olympians, while also echoing biblical accounts of giants like Nimrod the Mighty and the Flood. One of the central purposes of the tale of Brutus seems to have been to provide an indigenous race for the Trojans to conquer, thus cementing British identity as a force to be reckoned with. Ultimately even arguing that Brutus could have taken on Rome and won. He would have done it in Geoffrey's tale, were he not betrayed. Many versions of the tale go on to portray the origin of Brittany too, with Conan Meriadoc heading over with an army to help the Romans, ultimately being rewarded with wives who were shipped over, keeping Brittany ethnically pure. The three British peoples thus formed. By Geoffrey's day, their descent from glorious origins is explained, along with a fresh, albeit ultimately unsuccessful desire to reforge them with Norman might. In the wake of Geoffrey's story, the tale would continue to evolve, with men from England, France, and elsewhere adding their own spin and translating it into their own languages. But what of the earliest versions of the tale? Notably, a few decades earlier, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle had realised the potential of the tale. Geoffrey probably took it in part from there. Though 3 or 4 centuries earlier, the tale is told in the Historia Brittonum, an often wildly contradictory, synchronising history from North Wales. There, though Brutus gave his name to the island, he is a Roman consul and hated by all. Even earlier, the skeletal myth of Brutus was mentioned by Bede, and before that, Isidore of Seville's Chronica Maioria. In adapting and changing these already existing tales, Geoffrey sought to fill out the historiographical vacuum in Britain before the arrival of Julius Caesar, the first written account in British history. In Geoffrey's work, notably, Caesar is humiliated and defeated by King Cassiobalaenus. His venerated ancestry tracing all the way back to Brutus of 1,000 years before. Of course, also bringing King Arthur into the mainstream, and being one of the best sellers of medieval Europe. The sheer influence of Geoffrey's tale cannot be understated. Though by the latter half of the 12th century, the historian William of Newburgh reviles Geoffrey as not writing history at all. Henry of Huntingdon did not know the story of Brutus until he came upon Geoffrey's book. The creativity of one man has seldom had such an impact on world history. By that time, however, circumstances had changed. There would be no great political revival of the British past. New identities ultimately would be forged and pushed forward. Britannia becoming the disparate modern regions of Wales, Cornwall and Brittany. The stories would survive, however, though few realise it, all the way down to the days of the British Empire. A complex process of forgetting, remembering and retelling over and over again. Original meanings often reshaped and altered down the centuries. Split into two figures today, Gog and Magog, the mythical giants of old Albion, can still be seen every year, marching in the Lord Mayor's parade. King John was allegedly the first to put the giants into the parade, it apparently being common in those days in Europe to have giants paraded through town. And by the time of Henry V, two massive statues were allegedly made for the same purpose. Though at the time they may have represented Gog Magog and his slayer Corineus. In 1486, a great cliff figure of Gog Magog could still be seen at Plymouth, emblazoned on the hillside, at the supposed place where his fateful fight with Corineus took place. It disappeared in the years since, and by the time a new iteration of giants were crafted in the 17th century, Gog and Magog had become separated in the public psyche. Though these two mighty creations were destroyed in the Blitz, their remade smaller descendants, and the legacy of Britain's largely forgotten origin myths, can still be seen year-round in the London Guildhall today. Long before the coming of the Saxons, and even the Romans, they speak of a time when all Britain was one. A tale of 1,000 years, of 1,000 locations, of forgotten citadels and lost kingdoms, of mighty realms celebrated in the works of medieval scholars as Britannia. This isn't just the entire history of Wales after Rome, but Cornwall, Brittany, even Galicia in northern Spain too, and how these lands came to be. From the 4th century to the 7th, it is a tale spanning more than 200 years. The most mysterious in all of British history, when all the modern ethnicities we know today first came to be. My name's Pete Kelly, and you're watching History Time. Using all the cutting-edge archaeology, history, and mythology of the modern world to tell it. I travelled from the heartlands of Britain to the shores of the Bay of Biscay, using hundreds of sources, visiting almost as many locations. 5 years in the making. This is the story of the birth of a nation, forged from the ashes of the Roman world and suffused with new legacies and traditions. many parts of it told for the very first time. This is the entire lost history of Wales after Rome. In the early 5th century, Roman Britain collapsed. Not just because of invading armies, but because the economy itself fell apart. Coins stopped flowing, trade routes vanished, records were lost. And without good accounting, for the most part, the light of Mediterranean civilization vanished. Now, I'm not saying your business is about to fall like the Western Roman Empire, but keeping your finances organised is a pretty good way to avoid a dark age. Odoo is an all-in-one business management software, a toolkit for modern entrepreneurs. It helps you handle everything from accounting and invoicing to project management, inventory, and even your website, all in one place. With Odoo's accounting app, you can send professional invoices in seconds, track payments, and get real-time insight into your finances by syncing your bank accounts. You can also easily record your expenses and transactions, as well as having an overview of your finances with intuitive dashboards, without needing an army of scribes or a dusty ledger. Because while Rome fell when the numbers stopped adding up, your business doesn't have to. The application also automatically applies tax regulations based on your location to ensure you're in compliance with the law. Your first app in the Odoo suite is free for life, including unlimited hosting and support. And from there, you can add more apps as your empire grows, starting at an affordable monthly subscription. So, if you'd rather build civilization than watch it collapse, check out Odoo. Because even the Romans could have used better bookkeeping. Click the link below to start using your free app and keep your empire afloat. And now, back to the early Middle Ages. When the Irish king Matthieu sailed his ship out to sea that day, resplendent retainers around him, the sight greeting him when he came to shore wasn't an unusual one in those times. By the cliffs of Harlech, the giant Bran the Blessed sat his Goliath form upon a mighty hewn rock, gaze fixed over the Irish Sea. To the ocean god Manannan's watery domain beyond. For Bran was the High King of Britain in those days, and Matthieu had come to ask for his daughter's hand in marriage. Thus begins the second branch of the Mabinogion, one of the most important sagas in the entire history of Wales. a tale of love, sorrow, and a great all-encompassing conflict spanning both shores of the Irish Sea. Though it is a tale with roots in the deep past, it stretches forward in time too. Bran has many names. In Wales, he is Bendigeidfran, King of the Isle of the Mighty. In later Arthurian myth, he serves as the prototype for Bronn the Fisher King. It even remains entirely possible that he is a half-remembered version of Lugus, the Celtic creator deity, once venerated all throughout Europe, giving his name to Leon, Leons, Leyden, and leprechauns alike. It is a tale once sung in halls all down the western seaboard of Britain, by bards and storytellers, known as learned ones, with especially high status as court entertainers and propagandists for kings. The storytelling ability of weaving words to influence reality, long having been akin to magic. For of course, Bran's tale is not alone. The first branch of this most famous of collections of Welsh literature concerns Powys, Lord of the Kingdom of Dyfed in South Wales, as he spends a year journeying in the otherworld. Ominous mirror image of earthly life. The second tells the tale of the children of Bran, giant king of Britain, and their quest for vengeance in the wake of his treacherous killing at the hands of the Irish. The third follows on from the second, overflowing into magical enchantments in Dyfed. And finally, the fourth concerns a cataclysmic war between the northern kingdom of Gwynedd and Deheubarth in the south and west. Like all the great tales of the early Middle Ages, in its present form, the Mabinogion is an amalgamation of pagan and Christian themes, bearing similarities with both ancient Irish stories like the Ulster Cycle and Old English ones like Beowulf. The stories have no individual titles. They have no verifiable authors, despite the efforts of some with little actual proof to put them on individuals such as Sucharyna, Bishop of St. David's. Books that have never finished what they are trying to say. They are tales with deep, deep roots, usually considered the greatest contribution of Wales toward European literature, and some of the oldest. Originally a term seeming to mean boyhood, then a tale of a hero's boyhood, and finally morphing into meaning a tale in general. The four rather tenuously linked stories of the Mabinogion were first collected together between 1838 and 1849 by English scholar Lady Charlotte Guest, when she translated four of the stories from Welsh into English, from the White Book of Rhydderch and the Red Book of Hengist. High medieval collections dating to the 11th century, and likely with much older roots. The term Mabinogion has since expanded to include all 11 tales. Some are clearly fantastical holdouts from ancient mythology. A Celtic wizard sending forth armies of trees to fight beasts from another world. And all manner of magical items and events. Others don't seem so different from written chronicles, containing far more history than one might assume at first glance. We must turn to another of those stories now. Not just concerning Britain, but Rome. Our story begins far away from Britain, on the other side of the Alps, at the court of a Roman emperor, Maxen Ledig, a great soldier with a long pedigree of illustrious victories, the best fitted of those that came before him, we're told. One hazy afternoon, while out on a hunt in the country, Maxen falls into a deep, dream-infested slumber. Across continents and worlds, the Roman king wanders, drifting between realities and the great void, until finally he arrives by the banks of a great rugged river at the edge of the world, where mountains rise and mighty waves smash like thunderclaps against the shore. Though he has never seen this land before, it feels strangely familiar, like he has known it always. And amidst this otherworldly voyage, Maxen spies another person joining him on his journey. So beautiful a sight that he is transfixed immediately. And then, just as strangely as it began, it's all over. Upon awakening, however, such is his longing for the dream girl, the Emperor can no longer think of anything else. In the weeks and months to come, envoys and messengers wander the face of the earth in search of her identity. Until, on the banks of the River Scient in North Wales, astride the mighty mountains of Eire, or Snowdonia as they are known in English, they find what he seeks. Her name is Ellen Leardog, later to be known as Helen of the Hosts. She is a daughter of the local chief living under Roman rule, so far away. Beseeching the girl and her father to come with them to Rome, to marry the emperor at once, and put an end to all this nonsense. Stalwart and strong, she refuses. It is he who must come to her. Utterly transfixed by the beauty of the Welsh princess, Maxen has no choice, gathering his forces for a voyage to the Northlands. Upon arrival at the court of the Romano-British ruler Octavius, also known as Eudaf Hen, also the father of Conan Meriadoc, the alleged future founder of Brittany, a price is set, and the two are married, consummating the agreement afterwards. For her father, Helen's fee for her hand in marriage was nothing less than the governorship of the entire island of Britannia, as well as 3 major forts to be built in locations of her choice, and a great road network to connect them. At the stronghold of her father in the Northlands on the River Scient, she chooses Carnarvon, of course, where a Roman fort still stands today, in view of the great estuary where the two first laid eyes on each other. The others are prominent and very real Roman settlements too, at Caerleon and Carmarthen. For 7 years, Maxen stayed in Wales, building his forts and spending his days with his new wife. The court of her father at Carnarvon becoming his main residence as well as chief city in Wales. Until finally, word reaches the absent emperor of a usurper claiming the city of Rome in his absence. Amassing a great host of Welshmen under Ellen's brothers Conan and Gideon, they march to war on the continent, where Maxen regains his rightful place as ruler of the empire. In a strange, half-remembered nod to real events, after assisting in conquests in Brittany, Conan and his followers are allowed to stay there to settle. Ultimately, Maxen leaves for good, never to return to Britannia. Though never canonised officially by Rome, in the Welsh tradition, Helen is remembered today and revered as a saint. Though in reality built over hundreds of years, the 260-kilometre network of Roman roads that crisscrosses Wales today is still known as the Sarn Helen, in honour of the ancient queen. From the gold mines of Dalacouthi in the south, all the way to Holyhead and its flourishing trade to Ireland, running past innumerable forts and bastions from Caerhun in the north to Caerwent on the Severn. As with most parts of Britain, many sections are now used by the modern roads. Others are still traceable, and yet more are still lost or only recently being unearthed. What remains clear is that this was an immense achievement. Some areas seeming to have more infrastructure during the Roman period than they do today. Today, Maxen Ledig remains one of the most unique figures in all the medieval Welsh literature. Though his story shares elements with roughly contemporary Irish tales like The Dream of Angus, whether sharing a deep Celtic past or borrowing from each other more recently, it also contains a good deal of half-remembered genuine history. The Roman leader himself undoubtedly deriving from a genuine historical figure, Magnus Maximus, a military officer from Hispania and relative of the Theodosian Imperial family, who in 383 was declared Emperor of the West by the soldiery of Britannia, ruling over one part of the crumbling Western Roman Empire, though never in fact in charge of Rome itself, until he was ultimately defeated and executed 5 years later after an unsuccessful attempt on the Eternal City. Whilst many in learned Latin spheres, Nennius and Gildas among them, have blamed Magnus Maximus for not just the fall of Roman Britain, but even the Western Roman Empire itself in the centuries since he lived, for others, particularly in the popular sphere of vernacular literature, he was a great foundational figure. The first independent ruler of Britain even, from whom all legitimate power flowed in the years after. A folk hero who, like all the best myths, could be whatever they needed him to be. In the genealogies of Powys, for example, as well as Dyfed, Deheubarth and Gwynedd, he is claimed as venerated ancestor to the vaunted dynasties of kings. Whichever way the pendulum swings, just as it so often does on the question of how much continuity there really was from the Romans to the Welsh, often so deeply sought with only scant concrete evidence, Magnus Maximus has always remained deeply embedded in Welsh historiography. But who was he really? And what was the end of Roman Britain in Wales really like? By the time the soldiers of Britannia rose up their banners in support of Maximus in the midst of chaotic civil conflict spreading across the Western Empire in the early 380s, they did so in the tradition of a long line of similar usurpations originating in that corner of the empire, many of whom turned out to be hugely successful, either in carving off portions of the empire like Albinus, Carausius and Electus, or like Constantine the Great in conquering the entire realm. At the time of his raising to the purple in 383, soon afterwards transferring British troops to the continent, just as Stilicho and Constantine III would do after him in 401 and 407, it is possible that Maximus served as Dux Britannorum, or the Duke of Britannia. Arguments for his supposedly disastrous decision ringing hollow with the clear evidence of soldiery left in Britain in the aftermath of his reign. Though, like most Roman legions in Britannia, many of Maximus's men very likely had their origins in Germania, Spain and elsewhere. The historian Sozomen's account of him gathering a vast host of Britons, Gauls, Celts and tribes thereabout for his campaign against Theodosius in 388 may well have some truth to it. Just as it does in the much later, colourfully preserved 12th century tradition of a vast host of Welshmen being led to the continent for a triumphant final assault on Rome. Ultimately, though dubious claims of campaigns in modern-day Scotland are hinted at, Magnus Maximus spent much of his time in the verifiable historical sources on the continent, establishing a breakaway capital for himself on the Rhine frontier, minting his own coins, and ruling for 5 years. Though we can't say for sure, it seems likely he he chose the location to hold off Germanic invaders from beyond the frontier. And upon his death, as seen in tombstones and in the historical records, many of the men he brought from Britain may well have ended up far away in Illyricum in the Balkans. But what of the real Wales Magnus Maximus entered into and left behind? Still surviving tribal names in his time recorded as Deciangli, Ordovices, Demetae and Silures, just as they had been known before the Romans came. What happened to these ancient and illustrious peoples as the falling empire warred and crumbled around them? To travel in Wales today, by far the most unmistakable signs of the centuries of Roman occupation are the fortifications they left behind. From the outer works of Cardiff Castle to the immaculately preserved town walls of Caerwent, to forlorn earthworks at forgotten remote sites like Cefn Caer on the banks of the Dyfi River Valley. They can be found all across the country, seen usually in well-defined earthworks and moss-crusted banks. But every now and again, in immense edifices. Structures that would have been significantly more visible in medieval times. All in all, some 24 forts were constructed by the Romans across Wales, linked by hundreds of miles of roads. Almost all of them in the 2nd century AD. Archaeologically speaking, outside of these centres, the landscape remaining essentially prehistoric, with no towns or cities to speak of, and very little building in stone. Not just located at sites of strategic significance, forts almost always became the focus centres of both military and civilian activity. The goods of the Roman world filtering out to the neighbouring native peoples. In return for goods and services rendered to the Belgic, Hispanic, Germanic and men of other ethnicities who manned the forts, seeking citizenship in return for their service to the empire. In time, not just material goods, but ideas and romanitas spilling forth. It was from these centres, many tiny like Caer Gibbey on Holyhead, others massive like Caer Sws in the Midlands, ultimately turning into modern towns remembered with Caer place names, that the Romans truly subjugated conquered peoples. The largest like Caerleon and Chester, where permanent legionary garrisons of many thousands were held, having the biggest impact of all. Making Romans and complicit subjects out of the surrounding people, if albeit temporarily, and leaving a permanent legacy on the landscape in the form of flood dikes, watermills and roads. Technological achievements that astonishingly often remained unsurpassed until the 19th century or later. It is no wonder then that the medieval Welsh masses often chose to see the Romans, and Magnus Maximus in particular, as their venerable predecessors. Remarkably, almost all of that industry and military might came about during the time of just a handful of governors of Britannia. All of them at work during the first century or so of imperial investment. The most famous of all, his campaigns described vividly in the writings of his ever-admiring son-in-law Tacitus in the last few decades of the 1st century AD, was Gnaeus Julius Agricola. So great were the successes of Agricola, that emperor who never was, who marched his forces into northern Wales toward the end of the 1st century AD, following the hard-fought campaigns of his predecessors, that in the aftermath the Romans didn't have to do much more than endure. Bringing in Italian and Eastern goods and ideas to mingle with the Britons of the West. In 140 AD, in the wake of the building of Hadrian's Wall, when his equally lauded successor Antoninus Pius significantly reduced the permanent garrisons in Britannia, just one auxiliary fort remained in the northwest of what is now Wales. The others, apparently no longer necessary. All it took was a generation or two for the tried and tested Roman system to work, and the important work of extracting raw materials to pay for all the effort to begin. That sole fortress to survive in the still wild northwest, continuing to thrive until the very end of Roman Britain, was none other than Saguntium, the Carnarvon from Maxon's myth. By the 11th or 12th centuries AD, when the dream of Maxon was written down and solidified more or less in its present form, its author clearly harked back to a purported time in the past when not only had Wales been united and strong, but it, not England, had been the rightful ruler in Britain. For in those days, there is another mainstay in the towns that developed from the Roman forts. Almost all of them also housing the remains of a Norman castle. Carnarvons in particular having walls purposely reminiscent of Roman ones of days gone by, like those of Constantinople in the east. For of course, in the midst of the Norman invasion of Wales, a people who also saw themselves as the natural descendants of ancient Rome, this was a time of sorely needed stories of a glorious past. Not surprisingly, long before the entire country was subsumed under the impossible weight of Norman and English rule, there was a desire for unification. It is in this context of the long-standing policy of the Northern Kingdom of Gwynedd for hegemony over the rest of Wales that the text was probably written. Taking place in and around Gwynedd, whilst expertly weaving together long-existent traditions, current ideas, and the right of the North to rule over the rest of the country. In those days, when vaunted dynasties were being extinguished for good, one Welsh dynast shines brightly above all the others. And though we don't know for certain that Llywelyn ap Llywelyn, a castle builder and one of the only Welsh kings to be remembered as the Great, was involved with the writing of the tale, it seems very likely. He was a king who sought above all else to create a united Welsh identity through construction of ideological stories and institutions. In rewriting history and weaving a new future, the unnamed author of The Dream of Maxon enters a realm where new origin stories can be made, and new meanings given to past events and places. Stories of heroism linking Carnarvon, Carmarthen and Caerleon, three previously unconnected forts and power centres, into one story. But how Roman were these places really? And what can they tell us about the end of Roman Britain in Wales? Still one of the most significant population centres in the southwest of Wales. The town of Carmarthen, in fact, the first of those forts said to have been made in Maxon's day, doesn't seem to have played an important role in Welsh tradition until Geoffrey of Monmouth linked it to the tale of the wizard Merlin. Though nevertheless, it had been a very real Roman fort and settlement of some importance. Today, very little remains of the once significant Roman town which stood here in the west of Wales. Fragments of an amphitheatre and a few scattered earthworks being all that can be viewed above ground. Little more being visible from the air. A good deal of archaeology has been carried out though, and a popular theory is that the place served as the civitas capital of the British tribe of this region. The Demetae, one of around 20 such tribal centres across Britain. Specifically designed by the Romans to be a place of assembly for the various power brokers of a subjugated region, and their Roman masters. In those days, it was known as Meridionum. And though none survive above ground today, just like many places in the Empire, impressive town walls were built between 200 and 230 AD, complete with earthen ramparts and ditch. According to the geographer Ptolemy, who created a map of Roman Britain based on travellers' tales in the 2nd century AD, Meridionum was a polis. And like other polises in Wales, such as Caerwent in the southeast, the majority of its buildings were mercantile and artisanal in character. A little like a larger version of the forts, seeming to represent a centralisation of craft activity amidst the hefty rural hinterland they served. And within those countryside areas, aristocratic estates that border on the status of villas have been excavated. A clear example of the burgeoning inequality that very often accompanied the concept of Romanitas taking off. Thoroughly Romanised areas like Italy then going hand in hand with vast estates owned by individual families and presided over by legions of slaves. Not anywhere near that level yet. The estates of the Lords of the Demetae have nonetheless been suggested as being on the path to Romanisation. A previously unknown Roman road, recently excavated in Carmarthenshire during modern roadworks, further adds to burgeoning evidence of Roman activity in this region. And there are other hints too. The territory of the Demetae always producing more coins than other more peripheral areas. Perhaps unsurprisingly being concentrated in the coastal regions, where traders could easily have got around. Nevertheless, though having more evidence than much of Wales, on a whole, the southwest still seems to have been largely un-Romanised, though its enclaves of Romanitas would have important ramifications for the people who came after. The next of the 3 forts in the Dream of Maxon, with some of the most impressive of all Roman remains in Britain, is the town of Caerleon. Thought to have been the home of a prominent Roman legion, until the 3rd or 4th centuries. When the Cambro-Norman writer Gerald of Wales visited in the 12th century, he found it still exceptionally well preserved, with vast amounts still visible above ground. Speaking with wonder of the sprawling houses and wide streets, palaces and temples built with great skill and care. But perhaps most impressive of all was the amphitheatre that still stands today. In its heyday, capable of seating an entire legion of 5,000 to 6,000 men. Built early on in the conquest as a statement of intent and power. Unlike nearby Caerwent and Carmarthen off to the west, however, Caerleon had never been a centre for the local tribes. Being one of 3 legionary garrisons of occupying forces in Britain, alongside those at York and at Chester. These 3 sites arguably having even more of an impact in Romanising the surrounding peoples. The construction of immense bathhouses here show how Roman the place was, built around 75 to 77 AD. And wide-scale excavations over the last 100 years have shown more and more about the place. By Gerald's time, the large tetrapylon built as a statement of Roman authority still stood. But soon it would be gone. Its meaning having changed by that time already to be associated with Welsh kingship, harking back to times of old. Finally, the 3rd fort was of course Maxon's capital in Arvon, on the Scient River, standing on a hilltop just above the modern town and castle at Carnarvon. Excavated time and again for over 100 years, it isn't just famous from the Mabinogion, but claimed by the earlier 9th century Historia Brittonum too, as the place where Constantius, father of Constantine the Great, ended his life. Today, we know it as Sigontium. By the time Mortimer Wheeler arrived at Carnarvon in the 1920s, though individuals of an antiquarian dissuasion had been investigating nearby sites in Gwynedd for centuries, very few modern excavations of any Welsh forts had been carried out. As early as 1693, Cefn Caer on the marshy plain of Aberdyfi had been visited by Maurice Jones, rector of Dolgelly, and a partial excavation of Sigontium had been carried out in 1845, during the construction of a new vicarage in the southeastern corner of the site. But for the most part, academic information was lacking. With the arrival of excavators like Wheeler in the years following the First World War, using modern stratigraphic techniques, all this would change. Just like at Neath and at Brecon Gair, similar forts also excavated by Wheeler, and some of the most impressive left in Britain. Several wall sections and gateways still stood above ground at the time, never having been subsumed under the earth. Though standing high on a hill overlooking the estuary of the Cyent River, and Carnarvon Castle down below, Sigontium still stands very much within the limits of the modern town. The expansion of which in the late 19th and early 20th centuries had led to discoveries of traces of the extensive vicus, or civilian settlement, that sprawled far outside the outer defences. Just as the dream of Maxon described. Though only tiny sections have been available to be excavated due to the urban sprawl. Indeed, very recent excavations underneath Carnarvon Castle too have shown similar evidence of Roman occupation. And those scholars of a more sensationalist persuasion would love to equate this directly and categorically with the capital of Helen of the Host's father, just as they would the fortress of the giant Bran with Harlech Castle. Unfortunately, as with most modern cities and towns built directly over archaeological sites, the evidence remains ever elusive. However, Wheeler did find incredible evidence at Sigontium of just how unusual the fort really was, turning out to be one of the largest and most important settlements in the whole of Wales, with much more of a lasting impact than the others he excavated. Having been established by Agricola just after the seizure of Anglesey in the 1st century AD, and not being abandoned until the very end of the 4th century, perhaps even later, though no concrete evidence of post-Roman habitation has been found so far. Further investigations in the late 1970s only added to the story. Standing at the ramparts of the fort, extensive views over the western entrance to the Menai Straits can be seen. Anglesey, the breadbasket of Wales beyond. On a clear day, the mighty peaks of Airy can be spied to the south. Goliath Mountain, Snowdon, ever looming above. The Llyn Peninsula clear as day to the west. From this strategic and well-defended position, the tidal mouth of the Cyent provided a sheltered route for supplies ferried back and forth along the water roads to various outposts north and south. the fort of Hen Wallai, also situated at Carnarvon, known from a mere portion of wall still visible in back gardens, probably acting as a storage depot for the entire region. Indeed, just as in the Dream of Maxon, in archaeology, the late 3rd and 4th centuries heralded a new flurry of very real activity at the site. As well as the relatively nearby Cairgibbey naval fort in Holyhead and signal station on top of Holyhead Mountain, coin deposits, pottery, and even the construction of a Mithraeum at Sigontium, showing a good deal of occupation at this time. Just as many other forts were being abandoned. No other fort in all of Wales, and few in Britain, were occupied for as long as Sigontium. Suggestions have been made for the need to protect Roman interests against the operations of increasingly aggressive pirates from across the Irish Sea. In particular, the copper works on Anglesey, and perhaps silver-bearing lead along the Flintshire coast. The sequence of coins at Sigontium extends all the way into the Theodosian period, until at least 395 AD, suggesting Magnus Maximus did not, after all, strip the place of its soldiers entirely. The last official Roman soldiers from here perhaps being withdrawn to fight the revolt of Eugenius the Gaul after. But, soon enough, by the first decades of the 5th century AD, it had all come to an end. For all its sprawling civilian settlement and garrison of thousands, Sigontium passed into legend. As Cair Abersoyant, the fort at the mouth of the Saints River. By that time, the great bath at Caerleon had already collapsed into disrepair. Meridianum was largely abandoned for good. Something had gone terribly wrong. Whether Maximus could have conceived it or not, within just one generation of his demise, the world he'd known, allowing him to cross from one side of Europe to the other with relative ease, would be a thing of the past. Whether he knew this would be the case, we can only speculate. But end it would. The first signs of something amiss come at the very end of the 3rd century. After 150 years of gradual de-armament, a new defensive fleet was established on the Severn Sea, likely performing the sort of naval reconnaissance described as having taken place in British seas by the military strategist Vegetius. Brand new forts were raised at the mouth of Holyhead Harbour, the banks of the River Taff in modern-day Cardiff, where one named Ratastarbius was built, an unusual name, perhaps showing the Irish influence on those who built it, as well as at various other locations along the Irish Sea. Not to mention the state-of-the-art bastions of the Saxon shore on the east coast. At Carmarthen, Caerwent, Londinium, and most other Roman towns of Britannia, similarly formidable defensive works were suddenly deemed necessary. Roman Britain no longer able to rely on reputation alone as protection. Clearly, something had changed. Something that is clear from the contemporary written sources. In the 360s, the great Roman military historian Ammianus Marcellinus in particular describes devastating raids all over Britain by Picts and Irishmen, soon to be joined by Franks and Saxons. No longer mere pirates, but ravaging armies and expeditionary fleets. On one particularly dire occasion, we're told they overran the entire province, killing the Count of the Saxon Shore and imprisoning the Duke of Britannia. According to Marcellinus' account, the entire island only being saved by the timely arrival of a relief force from Hispania under Count Theodosius. Clearly, despite the hefty investments in bulwarks and bastions, the new Roman strategy was not entirely successful. Destruction and burning layers seen in the archaeology at many Roman settlements and reoccupied Iron Age Hillforts alike. Because there is more than just evidence of the Roman world at this time. During the course of the 4th century, and particularly in the ensuing centuries, the Britons, it seems, were now able to look to their own defences at sites like the Brython, Castel Odoo, Dinorban and Coigan Camp, among many others. Centres of native tribal culture and political native power structures re-emerging perhaps. The Romans either powerless to stop them, or even fully endorsing this re-emergence of the Iron Age culture, in preference to newer barbarian foes. For influential archaeologist and expert in post-Roman hillforts, Leslie Alcock, the lands beyond the Cambrian mountains were for the most part never truly pacified, let alone Romanised. And despite the trappings of the Roman world still showing up, suggesting contact and even tacit support, self-government increasingly began to be the norm. With yet more centres like Coigan Camp and Deganway seeming to have taken defence into their own hands, arguably only hastening the Roman decline. The Notitia Dignitatum, a miraculously surviving early 5th century list of Roman military posts in Britain and Gaul, suggests that by around 390 AD, no Roman forces were left in Wales. Caerleon and Chester had both been abandoned. Whether having been moved by Magnus Maximus or not, the force known as Seguntiensis, perhaps raised at Carnarvon, were by then in Illyricum. And yet, fascinatingly, just prior to the end of the 4th century, at Segontium, a dramatic increase in activity can be seen in the archaeology, as well as reoccupation at relatively nearby forts like Canovium in the Conway Valley, which had a deep enough port for large seagoing vessels. extremely useful to an ambitious local commander, or even a famed figure like Magnus Maximus. Just maybe a shred of reality buried within the Mabinogion. By that time, however, to make any lasting change, it was already too late. This time, simply too much had happened to recover from. Increasing societal instability, taking a hammer blow to the economy, already in terminal decline since the 2nd century. As a result of the disappearance of markets due to the withdrawal of official military units along with their pay, the economy would now entirely collapse. By the early 5th century, even Saguntium and its network of supporting forts at Caergybi, Canovium and Holyhead Mountain were abandoned for good. Within just a few decades, things began to go silent. Forests of alder and oak, seen in pollen records as being cleared in Roman times, began to grow back. Fields and settlements abandoned. History receding into myth. At Pembroke Docks, the layers of the past can still be seen near everywhere you look. Mighty cranes thundering back and forth to load cargo ships for the voyage out to the Irish Sea, to halfway around the world beyond. And besides all that machinery of the modern age, medieval ramparts and Iron Age hillforts still stand resolute. Napoleonic-era bastions, tower blocks and oil refineries alike. Not just financially, but strategically important too. Modern fortresses and bastions of elder days. Crawling along Milford Haven on a passenger ferry to Rosslare, it takes a long time to make the journey to the Skerries at the sea's edge alone. Let alone Ireland beyond. From its origins at Haverfordwest, both sides of the mighty waterway here are lined with towns, wind farms and industry. In the Second World War, the haven suffered heavy bombing from the Luftwaffe due to its manufacture of ships and its airfields. It's such a deep and lengthy waterway, in fact, that the British Navy used it as a launch pad to Ireland for centuries. From the 12th century days of the Norman warlord Strongbow to Cromwell. By the time the very last invasion of British soil was landed here by the French in the late 18th century, it was famous as a haven for fishermen. Soon becoming involved in ever more ambitious globe-spanning whaling exploits to the great blue beyond. And as the Victorian age rolled on in the mid-19th century, it was even hypothesised by some in high society that the banks of Milford Haven might continue to expand and evolve, ultimately becoming a super city the size of London. All that was needed, it was argued, like the new industrial powerhouses of Birmingham or Manchester, was for the disparate towns along the shore to connect up and forge a bright new future. That future never happened. Those 19th century theorists not having taken into account the often non-linear path of progression faced by humanity. The edifices of those Victorian days can still be seen, however, astride the mighty ramparts of Napoleonic times. The English, meanwhile, kept coming, just as they had since the days of Strongbow. By the 20th century, much to the displeasure of many of the locals, this entire region of Pembrokeshire was commonly known as Little England. The mind wanders when appreciating a place such as this. Those towers of lead and steel, the furnaces of industry chugging on just as they have for centuries. A single line of continuity from one generation to the next. Advancing, progressing, and sometimes regressing. But always going somewhere. Because, just as Roman Britain of the 4th century AD ultimately stemmed from the classical world of the Mediterranean of centuries before, ours is a world derived from our Victorian forebears. A great chain from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance to the information economy. Standing out on deck, it's not difficult to ponder the future too. To imagine what will be left in another 200 years from now. Just as the world of the late 4th century differed from that of 600 AD. So vast those modern structures are. It seems likely a great deal should survive. Even if the will or the means to build any more has gone. Even if they're reduced to ruins. It would take more than mere destruction to remove them. After 400 AD, however, the situation was different. A previous world of mighty edifices and succession from one generation to the next came to an end. Such was the loss of technology and meaning that the stones of previous structures were taken away for new, smaller buildings. Long crafted expertise having been lost. And by the time 200 years had passed, just shells remained. The forward momentum, generally oriented from the mind, from thoughts and societal consensus, coming to an end in a noticeable break. By far the greatest in all of British history. Such would likely be the case for our world if things were to go awry. The collapsing of towers and factories being brought about not by centralised civil engineering, but looters with little understanding of the world that came before. For at its heart, what is a society but an idea? At the outer edge of Milford Haven, the settlement of Dale stands resolute against the ravages of time. Sheltered beneath a vast headland, defended by no less than 3 Iron Age promontory forts. A castle has stood here for 1,000 years. It is a strange place, quaint, seeming stuck in time. With the industry of Milford Haven on one side of the village, the wild Irish Sea the other. The owner of the castle is still the landlord for many of the locals. And just adjacent to the village, an even older fortress still stands. This is Dale Fort. It's been altered so much over the years that its original form is barely recognisable. Today, military bastions of the Napoleonic era onwards have morphed the place, solidifying and changing with stone and concrete. Yet, underneath, that far older heritage still stands. The ancient Celtic past from a very different time at the end of the Roman world. Because Dale Fort has been excavated. And though only tiny fragments survive, in the form of a miraculously surviving earthwork bastion, a few potsherds and other refuse, habitation has been confirmed at the end of Roman Britain in the later 4th century AD. A time when Irish raiders would have been coming in from the outer edge to ravage and settle. Capitalising on the newfound weakness of Rome. This fort may have provided part of a defensive bastion for local British people, now fending for themselves after the Romans went their own way. Alternatively, some Romans, like Magnus Maximus, might have carried on here themselves, alongside British enemies or allies, as Irishmen no doubt walked amongst them too. Today, Dale can give us an incredible glimpse into that time, when forts all across the land began to be occupied once more. Whether one of these reoccupied forts existed here after the end of the 4th century, we can't say for sure. The evidence is simply too shredded, too fragmentary to say with any ambiguity being removed. But, as we shall see, many reoccupied Iron Age forts do exist all over Wales. by the end of the 6th century AD, living a completely unrecognisable life to that of 2 centuries before. We can see this total break that took place between 400 and 600 AD all over Britain, but in few places more so than the region around modern-day Cardiff. There had been a great city there in those days, Venter Silorum, the still lingering settlement known today as Caerwent. Once the administrative heart of the Silora's people, with some of the finest surviving Roman architecture anywhere in the world. Still a thriving town in the late 4th century, it was by then already a shadow of what it had once been. Mighty public buildings used for tribal meetings, superseded by newer concerns. Shanty structures having been thrown up within a new set of walls, erected during a brief resurgence of Western Roman power. By the year 600, a haunted shell of rubble and ghosts were all that remained. But some sort of a very different kingdom had arisen from its ashes. Today, we know it as Gwent. In 1586, a remarkable book was released by historian and antiquary William Camden. Britannia is an ambitious county-by-county description of the geography and history of the entire island. The first such work of its kind. Amidst innumerable fascinating episodes of how scholars of Tudor England viewed their own past, we get a description of Venter Silorum. Camden describing it as a very ancient city, whose name neither the rage of men nor time has extinguished. The mighty ramparts, the most intact of any of the northern provinces, still standing resolute at that time, just as they did 1,000 years earlier, and still today. A few decades earlier, another antiquary, John Leyland, described just 16 or 17 tiny houses still being inhabited within the mighty walls of the past, framed by a Norman motte and bailey on one side. Just how long people had lived there, and whether they had ever truly left, remaining a fascinating conundrum. In order to find out, as early as the 1700s, excavations began. They continue, periodically, to this day. Far wealthier than Carmarthen and Saguntium, for example. The south-east was by far the most Romanised part of Wales, almost matching lowland Britain in terms of its opulent houses, temples and high-status villas in the country around. Inhabited by around 3,000 people in its heyday. Archaeology suggests the population of the city to have been less than the 30,000 of Londinium or 10,000 of Viriconium. Though Nevertheless, it remained the largest settlement in Wales for 1,500 years to come. And the only definitely confirmed civitas. The place having been run by decurions chosen from the ranks of the Silures. We know this because in the 3rd century, well after their conquest by Rome around 150 years earlier, an inscribed stone was erected by the Silures in honour of a Roman commander named Riberius Claudius Paulinus. An act of gratitude by Romanized tribal leaders to a man whose patronage was worth cultivating. A man who would soon become governor of Britannia. Far from just seeking a place at the forefront of Roman society in the province, Venta had all the typical features of a Roman town. A forum, bathhouses, and a basilica. 3 or 4 temples to a variety of deities. A hotel with at least 40 rooms. And of course, townhouses and villas, complete with ornately carved mosaics, murals, and underfloor heating. Just 2 miles from the Severn, with easy access to the sea, and with dependent territories stretching far and wide into what is now Brecon, Glamorgan, and Monmouthshire. Venta was also well placed on the main road between Caerleon and Gloucester. And beyond that, the rich villa country around Bath and Cirencester. In the whole of Roman Wales, just a handful of villas existed, the most remote being built in Carmarthenshire. And of those villas, almost all existed in the southeast, in the vicinity of Venta. Sites like Llantwit Major and Barry being indistinguishable from most of those in the Cotswolds. Though Latin graffiti is seen scrawled over the walls at Caerwent, suggesting a glut of literacy, as well as tiny shreds of evidence in the form of inscriptions, for the most part, no history survives. The only mentions of the place coming in brief mentions in the 3rd century Antonine itinerary, a road book listing principal routes and stopping places, and the Ravenna cosmography, a 7th century topographical list based on earlier information. Much like many places in Roman Britain, in order to tell the story of the town and what became of it, we have to rely almost entirely on archaeology. But there is much here. That many thousands of people don't just vanish into thin air. Since 1888, excavations at Llantwit Major have suggested the place to have been built on new foundations, without an Iron Age predecessor. Here, at least, whether they were Silurian or from elsewhere, someone was enjoying all the wealth and power the Roman world had to offer. And while not quite on the level of the near-industrial scale villas in Provence and Tuscany, where the vastly outnumbered owners had become masters over legions of slave workers, capitalistic methods certainly were being introduced. pioneering new ways of undertaking agriculture, like heavy ploughs, as well as the introduction of new crops and species. Such British staples as apples, oats, parsnips, leeks, turnips, and carrots, all being introduced by the Romans during this time. And just like in Somerset across the Bristol Channel, and in the fens on the other side of the island, vast civil engineering projects were instigated too. These landscapes all being originally drained by Roman engineers, long before similar operations by medieval monks led to their more modern reclamation. In those days, the boggy marshes of the Gwent levels around Caerwent became some of the most fertile farmland on the whole island, just as they are today. At Goldcliff Point, the evidence of this can still be seen in great hewn ditches, leading to a time of great prosperity during the first half of the 4th century. By which time, in a completely different manner to the rest of Wales, the region had been thoroughly Romanised, with direct continuity from the Iron Age seen in some areas, with land ownership seeming to continue from before the conquest. The gentry ultimately becoming archaeologically indiscernible from other Romans. But of course, with all that prosperity came a price. Tellingly, impressive city walls were also constructed during this time, towards the end of the 360s. Perhaps in the wake of the so-called barbarian conspiracy, when covetous peoples from outside the empire spilled over the borders to take what they could. Such was the reality of life on the far northern frontier. But barbarians didn't conquer cities, not yet, tending instead to simply go around and strangle them into submission if relief forces did not arrive in time. There was no great invasion here, but a slow, lingering end. After the construction of a new temple to an unnamed god, almost no further buildings would be made in stone on the site. The latest coins at Caerwent in circulation seem to date from the start of the 5th century, dating from the reign of Honorius, in 4 buried hoards, hidden by desperate individuals seeking to come back to retrieve them later. They never did. Already 20 or 30 years before that time, it seems likely that Roman Wales had ceased to be governed by a central authority. Currency was no longer in use, having lost its meaning entirely, a barter economy taking its place, only further quickening the collapse. But how did this happen? How did glorious Venta go from its great townhouses to squalid hovels? The 100-year period from the construction of the last temple to the mythic establishment of the succeeding kingdom of Gwent, etymologically derived from the Roman name for the town, is one shrouded in mystery and chaos. Whether people continued living in the city, squatting in the remains of their ancestors, remains a hotly debated subject. There is almost no history, and very little archaeology to draw from. For lack of a better option, we can, however, turn to more unorthodox sources. Hagiographies, or saints' lives from later centuries, providing mythic foundations for the Kingdom of Gwent. The Gwent Levels are a land suffused with legend. Though no verifiable post-Roman evidence has been uncovered at the Iron Age Llanmelin Wood Hillfort, despite extensive digs in the 1930s, the place remains popular with fringe scholars. But, unlike many other places associated with the King Arthur legend, it having been posited as a potential location for Camelot, there is real evidence of post-Roman life here too. Not far from Venter, the village of Port Skewett overlooks the Severn. Great bridges running over the mighty sea road now belie its ancient foundations. Port Skewett has been inhabited for over 1500 years. According to hagiography, here once lived one of the earliest recorded Christian saints in the region. A half-remembered performer of miracles, originating in Ireland, living on the borderlands of myth and history. Written in the first half of the 12th century, the life of St. Tathius relates the move of the saint to Port Skewett on the behest of the local king. Caradog ap Unir. Sometime apparently in the 5th or 6th centuries. A king who similarly in some traditions is credited with moving the court of Gwent from Venter to the harbour at Port Skewett, where there was a fresh water spring. And a site remembered as one of the chief ports of Wales in a 7th century poem. But most importantly of all, though the harbour has now dried up, replaced by edifices of the Information Age, there is archaeology too. Wetland structures such as fish traps, and other evidence from the 6th century onwards have been located, and in 1973 a whole series of Christian burials were dug. Tracing an unbroken line of succession from the 4th to the 9th centuries AD. Lingering on to become something new entirely. It seems that Caerwent became Christian before the end. But can the surrounding region tell us anything more? At the eastern edge of Glamorgan, 28 miles or so along the coast from Caerwent, a wooded hill stands in the middle of parklands and farms. It's largely forgotten today, the domain of dog walkers, ramblers, and a middle-class suburb. Just one of many such castle mounds and ring forts found all over Glamorgan and wider Wales. Once clearly discernible overground fortifications, long having since rotted away. Few stop to notice the significance of the place now. Most mounds such as this date either from the Iron Age or the High Middle Ages, the Normans in particular being prolific in throwing up Motte and Bailey castles all over the land from the 11th century onwards. But a handful are different. Dinas Powys is one such site. In 1949, British archaeologist H.N. Savoury attempted to create a classification for all Welsh Hillforts. Arguing for one particular type of defended homestead, measuring less than 2 acres in size, to have been occupied exclusively in the Roman period. Dinas Powys was one of these sites, named for a small promontory enclosure. And even for that type, it was exceptionally small. The place was so obscure, in fact, that it had no verifiable name until digs began in the early 1950s. The chief excavator deciding to rename the site after the local town, which he surmised to have originally been called Dinas Powys in reference to that motte. For as we shall see, the place was much older than the Normans. The name of the excavator was Leslie Alcock, and we will be hearing much more from him, for he was destined to become the most prolific of all excavators of post-Roman hillforts in Britain. When Alcock first arrived to dig at Dinas Powys, he initially assumed the place to be 11th century in origin. What resulted was the unenviable task of disentangling a later Norman castle from the post-Roman remains that lay beneath. The resulting dig between 1954 and 1958 would become one of the most important of any site from that era, revealing 6 phases of occupation in all, the most intensive, Phase 4, dating to the 5th and 6th centuries AD. Just as Caerwent faded to oblivion. At Dinas Powys, unprecedented discoveries were made. One of the richest collections of locally made metalwork found anywhere during that time. And imported pottery too. Unfortunately, most of the metal was in a bad state of erosion, though reconstructions have shown it to have once made up several penannular brooches of an insular Celtic style. Items from outside Wales were found too. A strip of bronze ripped from a bucket, usually associated with Anglo-Saxon settlements, as well as the remains of a rare blue glass squat beaker, known elsewhere from the so-called princely burials such as Prittlewell and Sutton Hoo. Most interesting of all, however, were the goods that had originated outside of Britain. A glass bead coated in gold leaf, most probably originating in Coptic Egypt, and over 70 pottery and glass vessels, imported from production centres in southern France and the distant western Mediterranean. Some of them ornamented with stamped designs of crosses and other Christian symbols. The most impressive of which are a red bowl with a glossy surface, and another with freely arranged patterns of running felines. Though concealed by trees today, on high ground above the Severn estuary, Dinas Powys stands less than a mile from the estuary of the River Ely. Highway to the Severn Sea, Ireland, continental Europe, and even the Mediterranean beyond. The finds at the site suggest a person or dynasty of individuals possessing a great deal of wealth and power. Made even more the extreme by the lack of finds from almost anywhere else during this time. Given the wide-reaching trade contacts of the place, it is even tempting to think of the Lord of Dinas Powys sitting in his fortress drinking Mediterranean wine out of elegant glass beakers. And yet, far from the magnificent picture suggested in the heroic bardic tradition, picturing resplendent princes feasting their war bands in great halls, the reality of the site is a curious mixture of luxury and squalor. On a far smaller scale than the aristocratic Britons of the centuries before under Roman rule. A fact always highlighted by Alcock himself. The reasons for this become immediately clear upon visiting. The ramparts enclosing an area of just 100 by 190 feet. One of the most famous and highly publicised finds from the dig, however, was the buildings themselves. One of them, widely interpreted as a royal hall. The first sight that greets you when arriving at Dinas Powys today, after traipsing through woodland for what seems like far too long, are the massive earthwork ramps and ditches at the southern entranceway. 10 feet wide and 5 feet deep, with earth thrown up to create a rampart on the inner side. As Dinas Powys is a whale-back hill, with steep, impenetrable cliffs on the other sides, these were ample defence to keep any unwanted visitors out. Originally, Alcock had dated banks 1, 3 and 4 to the 11th century, only later confidently reassigning all of them to the 5th and 6th. One of the tiny handful of sites then having been discovered from that time. The banks only seem to have survived at all by chance, having been incorporated into the Norman defences, and surviving intensive farming only by the dense thickets of trees that coat its surface. When walking by those earthen banks, it's easy to contemplate why so few sites like this are left now. The others having already been lost to the plough long ago. Inside the enclosure, two principal buildings once stood. One in particular, complete with drainage gullies and rich assemblages of animal bones in midden heaps, has famously been interpreted as a feasting hall. Akin to Beowulf and the Mabinogion. Though some of the stones had been removed and reshaped by later Norman builders, the buildings survived relatively well, surrounded by the slag heaps of at least 5 carefully built hearths. Attesting to the on-site manufacture of fine jewellery of copper, silver and gold, along with the smithing tools to go with them. In addition to potentially quaffing exotic wines from the Mediterranean, those who lived here regularly dined on pork, mutton and beef. In comparison to the vacuum of elsewhere at this time, where the concept of pottery making itself had disappeared by the end of the 4th century, it does seem increasingly likely to have been at least a kind of a princely hall fit for a sort of a king. The kind of place where Beowulf's thanes would assemble and sleep, the king himself retreating to his wife's hall in the second smaller building after the feast's conclusion. Whether the metalsmiths of Dinas Powys, like bardic poets, were peripateic, travelling far and wide to seek out the patronage of chiefs and kings, or whoever paid the best, we simply don't know. Though bardic allusions in the storytelling traditions often hint at such an arrangement. In the years since the Alcock's digs at the site, many such metalworking centres have been found from the same time. At Chun Castle in Cornwall, the Moat of Mark in Galloway, and elsewhere. Though by his own admission, when compared even to the Iron Age Laten metalworkers of close to a millennia earlier, Alcock reminds us that the smiths of Dinas Powys pale in comparison. The hall itself is a relatively meagre affair too, a sub-rectangular house of dry stone wall, similar in size to other so-called halls found at Cadbury Congresbury, Cadbury Castle, and perhaps at Castle Door, though the latter may in fact not date from the same era. All are minuscule compared to the rich Glamorgan villas of Roman Britain. Today, Dinas Powys remains the most extensively excavated post-Roman hill fort in Wales, and the richest in the quality and quantity of its material evidence. But it is a place of contradictions, seeming to shift whichever way you look at it. On the one hand, it is often compared to the great hall complexes of Anglo-Saxon England and Scandinavia. Sites such as Yevering and Rendlesham. A focal point for patron-client relationships kept alive through feasting and the manufacture of prestige goods. A theatre of power, where gift exchange and the collection of tribute was facilitated. Imported glass and local metalwork, sometimes associated with a kind of sacred kingship. On the other hand, its tiny size led Alcock to once describe it as the squalid and inconvenient eyrie of a nest of robbers. Dinas Powys has even been argued to be an early court or leas and hall of a Christian chieftain. Terms, in fact, from much later medieval writings. Apparently enjoying a relationship with a local Christian site. Perhaps the post-Roman cemetery and monastic site at Llandough. Largely attested from the 7th century, but where 5th and 6th century imported amphorae and glass are also found. Though in truth, there is nothing specifically Christian about Dinas Powys. Enjoying wine does not necessarily equate to Romanitas, nor Christian belief. We must even entertain the remote possibility that all the exports came from a single wayward ship. Given the good deal of evidence for Christianity, both before and after the fall of Roman Britain, it is likely that a kind of missionary activity, left adrift to develop in Britain on its own, did indeed have a marked impact on the population, going hand in hand with a reorganisation of ideological transformations related to the end of Roman imperial control from the Mediterranean. Rulers like those of Dinas Powys may well have leveraged their access to the spiritual to gain power in the eyes of their subjects. The strategic placement of Dinas Powys, then, and just how it controlled its hinterlands, has huge implications for understanding power and the first kingdoms that formed in post-Roman Britain. Construction here taking place at the very same time as the abandonment and reorganisation of villas, farmsteads and urban settlements such as Venta Silorum, not far away. But for the most part, already a memory. Unfortunately, despite centuries of research, there still remain real issues in understanding how and even where people lived in Britain during this time. Just how exactly supposed dynasties like the one hypothesised at Dinas Powys were able to initially leverage the resources to carve out their kingdom, foster connections with the Mediterranean, and even employ an on-site jeweller. Just how large such a polity might have been remains largely a mystery. As does what the Mediterranean traders got in return. Though a complex exchange network along the Severn Sea, with Tintagel in North Cornwall as the central tin trading hub, has long been suggested, with coastal sites almost always seeming to be favoured. Though hard evidence remains scant, meagre hints of a kingdom can nonetheless be threaded together. Just an hour or two's walk from Dinas Powys, by a council estate in Cardiff, a monster of a hill fort looms. Hidden to most residents of the city in a most unlikely of locations. This is Cairo. one of the mightiest Iron Age hillforts in all of South Wales, and one which has seen a fair bit of excavation in recent years. Though the colossal ramparts of Cairo had been dug long before the Romans ever came to Britain, tiny hints of habitation afterwards have been pinpointed too. Certainly a medieval ringwork is sited on the top of the hill, as well as an adjacent church. A post-Roman settlement in such a place of the ancestors is at least semi-plausible, though evidence is lacking so far. Another site in the region, which shares many similarities with Dinas Powys, is the unexcavated Bivallet Fort near Llanfythin. Only future digging will determine definitively when this site dates to, though some scholars like Andy Seaman and Leo Thomas have suggested all three of these sites to have been one part of a network of interrelated power centres. A sort of peripateic kingship even, not unlike that practised by much later medieval kings. The likes of Llywelyn the Great of Gwynedd, known to have journeyed between the various courts over the year, rather than having one singular base. Dinas Powys then, a gatekeeper to the outside world, standing just 4 kilometres from the sea, and 2 from the nearest landing site, could have been just one site among many in a sort of proto-kingdom. A cross-estuary polity is even possible too, the fort being only 30 kilometres over the water from the contemporary forts at Cadbury Congresbury, Brent Knoll and Cannington in Somerset. With Congresbury in particular actually being visible from Dinas Powys and vice versa. It even shares similar features with Dinas Powys, such as a rectangular building similarly interpreted as a hall. Though it remains equally possible that any of these post-Roman sites could have made up connected polities or acted as strongholds for singular elite families, it does seem likely that their inhabitants operated within the same network of elites. Particularly those visible from one another. Perhaps, if relatively friendly, a system of beacons on hilltops, uniting them in times of trouble. Certainly, like most hillforts, Dinas Powys enjoyed a great vantage point to see widely over the landscape. No one could arrive at the nearby navigable landing points at Sully and Cogan Pill without being clearly seen. And those moving through the landscape likely would have acted accordingly, perhaps paying homage to the dynasty there in order to do so. We know that in later centuries, the landed aristocracy wielded a considerable amount of power over their immediate dependents, largely engaged in farming, of which they would give a portion of tax. Rather than feeling loyalty towards the kingdom itself, the relationship was with the king. Mafia-esque dons, generally seeming to have origins in the 5th century. Military obligation being a personal oath to the Lord. Armies, therefore, varied hugely based on the personal charisma of the Lord. Even so, the estimates of the Black Book of Carmarthen, of 600 to 900 in an army, dating to the 12th century, would generally have been far too many for our age, though may have represented a similar sort of system. Something like 50 to 100 men, likely being the norm. Still a formidable force to reckon with for unwanted visitors into a land like that of Dinas Powys. And come, they probably did. War remaining a key form of funding and gaining and preserving prestige. Any warbands who did come in from afar would have had to face the King's warband, kitted out with Germanic equipment, found all over Hillforts that were never conquered. Their goal to acquire livestock, slaves, and riches. In a very different world to that once enjoyed by the citizens of Caerwent. There is, therefore, an argument for Dinas Powys forming the focus of a petty kingdom in the Vale of Glamorgan, and Cardiff Basin from the 5th century onwards. Either forged in the fires of Roman collapse, or in the vacuum thereafter. Until it was finally subsumed into the larger kingdom of Glywysing, around the time of its abandonment in the later 7th century. Perhaps this abandonment being no coincidence. Now that we have constructed one potential early kingdom, what can we say of Venta Silorum, just a day's walk away, and of Gwent, the venerable kingdom that supposedly succeeded it? By the time the ramparts of Dinas Powys were being dug, the Gwent levels had already broken their banks. Without the careful maintenance of the provincial government, persistent floodwater gradually returned the place to its natural state. But it wasn't just the coastal wetlands that made a comeback towards the end of the 4th century. Pollen samples taken from Wentwood, suggesting a significant re-emergence of birch, beech, oak, hazel, and ash, accompanied by the widespread abandonment of settlements and villas. After centuries out in the cold, the wild wood began to return. At both Caerleon and Caerwent, not only did construction of new buildings come to an end, but many others began to fall down for lack of maintenance. Though we can't rule out the last inhabitants continuing to live on or squat in the ruins for a time, there certainly weren't enough people to man the walls, making them potentially vulnerable to raiders. With the surrounding landscape going wild again, the last inhabitants of urban South Wales may have simply left. For lack of a better option, heading out into the unknown, to seek somewhere more easily defensible to live. Certainly by 500 AD, Caerwent had come to an end. Archaeologically speaking, the most densely settled area in all of Roman Wales is followed by an extreme lack of settlement evidence of any kind. As we have already seen, unlike Dinas Powys, the Kingdom of Gwent does exist in certain, albeit questionable, semi-historical sources, originating in a much later age. The 12th century life of St. Tathius, in particular, speaks of the journey of an Irish monk during the 5th or 6th centuries. Following visions of an angel who spoke to him, Tathius, the son of an Irish king, travelled across the sea with 8 disciples, and up the River Severn, making landfall in the Kingdom of Gwent. Tathius was feasted by the local king, Caradoc, going on to found a monastic school there at his town of Venta Silorum. Though no verifiable evidence exists for Caradog's existence at all, he would later be immortalised as a knight of King Arthur no less. A more grounded suggestion for his origin, if any shred of reality remains, would be a descent from the last Decurions, or ruling council of Venta. There are other sources too. Some relevant, though mostly questionable information being found in the Book of Llandaff, again likely originating much later in the 12th century. Though some scholars like Wendy Davis date it much earlier, to the 7th century. Ultimately, the book suggests that Meirig ap Turig, living sometime in the 5th, 6th or 7th centuries, extended his power from his home kingdom of Glywysing over Erging as well as Gwent. Rarely mentioned historically on their own. According to archaeologist Ken Dark, both kingdoms ultimately deriving from the last vestiges of the Silures, eventually forming 2 constituent parts of the larger kingdom of Morgannwg, better known today as Glamorgan. Morgan being the supposed ancestor of a line of kings who would rule in these parts for 500 years to come. Though yet more garbled histories suggest occasional factionalism within the Kingdom of Gwent itself, with the southeastern corner, Gwent Isco, occasionally ruled by a breakaway dynasty. In reality, the only thing we can be completely sure of is the scientifically dated remains. Most importantly, those individuals buried at the Christian cemetery at Caerwent, between the 5th and 10th centuries AD. And those at Llandough, near Dinas Powys. If only they could speak and tell us whether there was any real succession from the Roman world. Because, though there isn't much evidence of it in South Wales, quite paradoxically, in the rest of the country, in regions that were actually far less Romanised, there is a great deal. By the time the Roman way of life definitively ended in Britain by around 450 AD, there was a significantly reduced standard of living than before the Romans came. Where before, vast city-sized hillforts had dominated the island, coinage being widespread among many of the lowland peoples. Now, a barter economy had taken over. Scattered settlements, just pinpricks in a lawless land of chaos. And yet, the names of hundreds of individuals survive on memorial stones. People whose commemorators often chose to consciously hark back to that world before. Well over 300 named individuals in Wales alone, not just often going by Roman names, like Maglicunus, son of Clutorius, and Vitalianus Emeretos at Nevern in around 500 AD, and Macaritinus, son of Bericus, by Swansea. But also using often grandiose terms. At least 2 kings are noted, 4 saints, and other more unusual terms too. In around 500 AD, a certain Cantiarix is described as a citizen of Gwynedd. On Anglesey, Melisat Llangeanan is described as doctor. The stone of a certain Cantiacus states he was a cousin of Maglos, a magistrate. And finally, in Carnarvonshire in around 540 AD, we have Justinus, the consul. It is a fascinating conundrum. Did these individuals truly understand the gravitas of such titles? Or did they use them in order to inspire some sort of a harking back or authority? Perhaps speaking more of Christianity than of a Roman pattern of administration as we would recognise it. Fascinatingly, many of the stones have another writing system on them too, derived not from British or Roman, but from another newly Christianised land across the Irish Sea. This is Ogham, and it is some of the best evidence for the Irish invasions of Britain taking place at this time. And many of the memorial stones in Wales are bilingual, having Ogham as well as British or Latin inscriptions. A certain Bivardus, for example, son of Bodibava, a Latin chieftain with a hereditary Roman title, was written in Ogham too, this early system of Irish writing. Another commemorates Paulinus, preserver of the faith, constant lover of his country, the devoted champion of righteousness. Ogham stones are found all over the west of Britain, all over the Severn Sea, and beyond on Scilly, the Isle of Man, and even Scotland. And it is to these Irish settlers in Britain, seen in archaeology, myth, and history, that we turn to next. as we move beyond the civilized south to the wild west coast and the north.
Whew! Well, that was a lot of fun. An absolute joy to make, in fact. For 5 years I've been working on it. Reading, researching, writing, rereading, visiting sites. I visited pretty much every single site in the entirety of Wales from this time period, between the 400s and the 600s. Now, the initial script was 40,000 words. It's since ballooned, I think, to about 50,000 words. It's nearly a whole book. So, of course, this episode is just one of, I think, 9 episodes I had planned. These are all my scripts, basically. Absolutely loads of them. I get a bit carried away, okay? But that's the joy of this thing. That's the joy of this thing. So yeah, years of work goes into these things. You may have noticed that YouTube is sort of, at the moment, the end of 2025, filled with a lot of content that, let's just say, isn't very well researched and hasn't had a lot of effort put into it. So, bizarrely, this is what it's come to. I just wanted to say that I am a human being. I'm the guy who does everything on this channel. I do all the research, I do all the writing, I do all the narrating, I do all the video editing, I do all the putting of the music to the videos. Unless in the video description I say this video was edited by so-and-so, this video was written by so-and-so, which does happen. But yeah, by and large, the main big videos, it's just me. Unfortunately, I am only human. But yeah, if you want to hear anything more from me, I've got my own channel called Pete Kelly, which is like a subsidiary channel to this main one, History Time. You can go and watch that on the link here. You can also watch the entire back catalogue of History Time. I've been doing this for nearly a decade now. Alternatively, I have a Substack, which you can go and read, which charts my adventures around the world at the world's greatest archaeological sites. Been a lot of fun working on that channel. And of course, make sure to subscribe here for when the next episodes in this series come out. Next one is going to be on the Irish invasion of Wales in the 5th century AD. Absolutely awesome, unheard of period of history. People don't tend to focus on that period. And after that, of course, we go to the northern kingdom of Gwynedd and we speak about the incredible goings on there, which is probably my favourite kingdom of the period. So that's going to be a really special episode. And after that, we continue to investigate everything that goes on in Wales between the years 400 and 600. It's all coming, guys. It's all coming. All in these research books I've got here. These research sort of packs of dense information that I've written. So yeah, guys, it's been beautiful. I'm loving doing this. But unfortunately, in this new era of the AI slop inundation, you're going to have to see a little bit more of me on screen. So I'm sorry about that. Ideally, I would like it to not be so. I'd like to just remain the disembodied narrator. But unfortunately, if you put effort into anything these days, it's assumed you've used AI. So yeah, this is me, this is my library. I'm Pete Kelly. See you on the next one.